You, Alicia Moore's voice cut through the panic like a scalpel through silk. Her emerald eyes locked onto the man in grease-stained coveralls standing near the door. You really think you can fix this? Jeremy Wilson stood frozen, toolbox heavy in his calloused hands. 37 investors and engineers turned toward him in perfect synchronization, their $1,000 suits a stark contrast to his worn work clothes that still carried the faint smell of motor oil and honest sweat. Alicia rose from her chair at the head of the glass conference table. Her Louboutin heels clicked against the polished chrome floors as she approached him, each step deliberate, measured, predatory. She stopped close enough that Jeremy could smell her perfume, something expensive and cold that mixed with the undeniable scent of contempt. "Tell you what, maintenance boy." She snapped her manicured fingers near his face. "Fix this $8 million prototype that my MIT and Stanford engineers couldn't repair, and I'll give you anything you want." Her lips curved into a smile, sharp enough to draw blood. "Hell, I'll even marry you right here in front of everyone." The room erupted in laughter. Camera flashes captured the moment from every angle. But when you fail, and you will fail, you're done. Not just fired, done. She gestured toward the dead engine behind her. "Security will make sure you never step foot in this building again." The laughter died. Silence settled over the room like ash. 150 million in international contracts hung on that broken machine. The future of Velocity Motors sat sparking and lifeless on the showcase platform. Have you ever been so completely invisible that someone wagered their entire reputation on your failure? This is the reality for people judged by their cover, not their capability. If you believe these stories need to be heard, you're already part of this mission. Subscribe to Speak Black and hit the bell, because the most powerful tool we have against prejudice is a story that makes people listen. Velocity Motors rose from Manhattan's steel jungle like a monument to American innovation. The 60-story glass tower dominated the skyline, its sleek exterior reflecting clouds and ambition in equal measure. Inside, the air smelled of leather seats, imported coffee, and the kind of money that doesn't ask permission. Alicia Moore had built this empire with surgical precision and an iron will. At 42, she commanded boardrooms like battlefields. Her intelligence was undeniable. 3 engineering patents before 30, 2 acquisitions that reshaped the auto tech industry, and a reputation for turning concepts into billion-dollar realities. The tech world called her a genius. Her employees had other names they whispered in stairwells and parking garages. The company's crown jewel now sat broken before a room full of witnesses. The Velocity One. This wasn't just another prototype. It was 3 years of research, 89 registered patents, and the combined brilliance of the industry's most celebrated minds. The hybrid engine promised to revolutionize automotive technology with its AI-assisted power management system, delivering 97% fuel efficiency while producing 0 emissions. One successful demonstration could redefine transportation. One failure could destroy everything. For 43 days, this machine had humiliated every expert who touched it. 4 separate engineering teams had failed. 112 diagnostic tests yielded nothing but mounting frustration and cryptic system errors. The engine would fire up, run perfectly for exactly 17 minutes and 42 seconds, then overheat and shut down with the same maddening message flashing across its diagnostic screen. Torque feedback loop, harmonic disruption detected. Jeremy Wilson knew every corner of Velocity Motors' gleaming floors. For 2 years, he'd moved through these halls like a ghost, pushing his maintenance cart past executives who looked through him as if he were furniture. His badge read Technical Support Specialist, corporate speak for the man who fetched coffee, cleaned workstations, and disposed of test components. Nobody knew about the engineering sketches he drew in his studio apartment at night. Nobody asked about the mechanical engineering courses he'd completed at City College before his world collapsed. While his classmates had gone on to graduate programs and signing bonuses, Jeremy had made a different choice. When his father was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, the math became brutally simple. Experimental treatments cost $4,500 per session. Insurance covered barely half. Someone had to make the sacrifice. Love always came before dreams. The engine crisis grew more desperate each day. Alicia's morning briefings stretched longer, her voice rising with each failed attempt. She paced the conference room like a caged animal, her perfectly composed exterior cracking under the weight of impossible expectations. Investors were losing patience. The board was asking questions. The media was circling. Jeremy had watched from the margins, invisible as always, his instincts screaming the answer nobody was asking for. He'd seen this exact failure pattern before, back in his father's garage, in a much simpler engine, during a summer that felt like another lifetime. He'd kept quiet. Men like him didn't speak up in rooms like this, until the engine failed on demonstration day, until Alicia's desperation turned to mockery, until she gave him one impossible chance to do what her experts couldn't. Now he stood at the threshold of that glass and chrome conference room, the weight of his father's old screwdriver pressing against his chest pocket, while laughter echoed off walls that had never known his name. The story of how Jeremy Wilson got to this moment, standing between humiliation and redemption, began in a place far from Manhattan's towers, in a small southern town where engines spoke and fathers taught their sons to listen. In Hazelwood, Georgia, time moved slower. The air was thick with humidity and the distant scent of pine. But for young Jeremy, the only air that mattered was the one inside his father's garage, a holy space that smelled of motor oil, iron, and dreams. Sunlight streamed through the single dusty window, illuminating dancing motes in the air. An old gospel radio station played softly in the background, a constant, comforting soundtrack. This was his cathedral, and his father, Arthur Wilson, was its priest. Arthur was a mountain of a man with gentle hands, his coveralls permanently stained with the evidence of his work. He moved with a quiet certainty, a deep understanding of the mechanical hearts he healed. "Bring me the 10mm, son," Arthur would say, his voice a low rumble. Jeremy, no more than 8, would scramble to find the right socket, learning the language of tools before he'd fully mastered his own. One afternoon, a neighbor's pickup sat stubbornly silent in the bay. Arthur didn't rush. He placed a hand on the engine block and closed his eyes. "What are you doing, Daddy?" Jeremy whispered. "Listening," Arthur replied, not opening his eyes. "Every engine speaks, son. The trick is learning how to listen, not just to the noise, but to the silence between. That's where the truth hides." It was more than mechanics. It was a philosophy. Arthur taught him that machines, like people, had stories. A worn bearing spoke of long, hard journeys. A dirty filter told of dusty roads and neglect. You had to care enough to hear them. But even in this sanctuary, shadows lingered. A deep, rattling cough would sometimes seize Arthur, doubling him over, a sound that seemed to shake the very tools on the walls. Jeremy would watch, his small heart pounding, as his father would wave it off. "Just a summer cold, Jay, don't you worry." The medical bills, hidden in a kitchen drawer, grew into a silent, looming monster. Jeremy saw the worry in his mother's eyes, the way his father worked longer hours, taking on any job, no matter how small. It was this struggle that forged Jeremy's own dream. He didn't just want to fix engines. He wanted to build a better one. Sitting on a stack of old tires, he'd sketch designs in a worn notebook. An engine that was both powerful and affordable, one that wouldn't break the people it was meant to serve. The cough never left. It worsened, becoming a permanent, grim companion. The summer cold was stage 4 lung cancer, and the fight was brutally short. At the funeral, under a sky of relentless blue, 12-year-old Jeremy stood clutching his father's old screwdriver, the metal warm in his palm. It was the first tool Arthur had ever given him. It felt like a final, fragile connection to the man who had given him everything. He looked at the casket, then down at the tool in his hand, and made a silent promise. He didn't just inherit his father's tools. He inherited his purpose. The purpose was a heavy weight for a 12-year-old's shoulders, but Jeremy carried it. For 10 years, he tried to keep his promise to his father's memory. He finished high school and, using every cent of his savings and a mountain of determination, kept Wilson and Son Auto open. The N Son now felt like a plea to a ghost. He worked tirelessly in that same dusty garage, the scent of oil now mixed with the acrid smell of stress. He was a good mechanic, a great one even. He had his father's touch, but he didn't have his father's era. The world had changed. Corporate chains with their cheap, fast service siphoned away customers. The cost of specialized parts for newer cars skyrocketed. The quiet, trusting relationship his father had built with the town was being outsourced to algorithms and call centers. The medical debt from his father's illness was a chain around his ankles, pulling him under. The bills his parents had tried to hide were now his, and they were suffocating. Each envelope in the mailbox was a fresh wave of dread. He'd lie awake at night, the numbers scrolling behind his eyes, a relentless, unsolvable equation. The garage's income was a slow leak, and the debt was a gaping hole in the hull. The final blow came on a rainy Tuesday. The bank's letter was polite, sterile, and final. The loan he'd taken out to cover his mother's medical bills was in default. Foreclosure proceedings would begin. He stood in the garage, the rain drumming a funeral march on the corrugated tin roof, and knew he was beaten. He had to sell. The sale of the property, after paying off the debts, left him with just enough for a one-way bus ticket and 1 month's rent in a city that promised a fresh start, but only if you were strong enough to survive it. New York City did not greet Jeremy Wilson. It absorbed him. It was a shock to every sense. The constant, deafening roar of traffic and humanity replaced the quiet hum of Hazelwood. The air, thick with exhaust and the smell of roasting nuts from street carts, was a far cry from the garage's honest perfume of oil and gasoline. He rented a studio apartment in Brooklyn so small he could touch opposite walls, the floor vibrating with the rumble of a subway he couldn't afford to ride often. He was a single, anonymous drop in a river of millions. His father's old screwdriver was one of the few possessions he brought, a talisman in a world that felt utterly alien. Miraculously, he got a job at E-Velocity Motors. When the acceptance email arrived, Jeremy felt a surge of hope so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. This was it. The door was opening. He was going to be near the kind of cutting-edge engineering his father had dreamed of. He pictured clean labs, collaborative whiteboards, the hum of innovation. He was finally going to be part of a team that built the future. The reality was a swift and brutal correction. His technical support specialist badge was a cruel euphemism. He was not an engineer. He was the help. His world became a circuit of humiliation, fetching coffee for men who never learned his name, cleaning grease from tools he wasn't allowed to touch, and disposing of expensive test components that had failed for reasons he could instantly diagnose. The engineers, crisp in their branded polo shirts and Patagonia vests, were a different species. They spoke in a language of acronyms and code, their laughter echoing in the high-ceilinged labs. They called him the Garage Boy. The term was always delivered with a faint, condescending smile, a reminder of where he came from and why he didn't belong here. It was a subtle, casual bigotry, one that dismissed his deep, earned knowledge because it was born in a place of grit and grease, not in a sterile university lab. He was invisible. When he walked into a room with a fresh pot of coffee, conversations didn't pause. They simply flowed around him as if he were furniture. He watched them struggle with the very concepts his father had simplified for him a lifetime ago. He saw them overcomplicate, relying on diagnostics that couldn't hear the soul of a machine. Jeremy endured it all with a quiet that masked a simmering fury. He nodded. He fetched. He cleaned. He swallowed the insults and the indifference. Every night, he returned to his cramped apartment, the city's bright lights mocking him through his single window. There, he would take out a worn notebook, the same one he'd used as a boy, and sketch. He drew engine diagrams, hybrid systems, and power management solutions that were elegant in their simplicity. These sketches were his secret rebellion, his sanctuary, the only place where his genius was allowed to breathe. And it was a true genius, one that Velocity Motors was blindly trampling. As he cleaned their workspaces, he couldn't help but see the printouts, the schematics, the error logs. He noticed a pattern, a recurring flaw in the torque converter housing for the Velocity 1 prototype. The engineers were chasing software ghosts, but Jeremy's eyes, trained to see the physical, the real, saw it immediately. A fundamental design flaw in the mounting bracket that was causing a microscopic misalignment under stress, creating the very harmonic disruption that baffled them. He saw the solution as clearly as he saw the problem. A simple, reinforced alloy bracket. A $5 part and 10 minutes of work. He looked at the chief engineer's scrawled notes, pages of complex calculations that were, in his professional opinion, completely missing the point. He held the knowledge that could save their multi-million-dollar project. And he said nothing. Men like him didn't speak up in rooms like this. His place was to be silent, to be invisible, to fetch the coffee while they continued to fail. So he tucked the knowledge away, a secret weapon he never intended to use, and went back to wiping down their whiteboards. 42 the floors above, where Jeremy Wilson wiped coffee stains and swallowed his pride. Alicia Moore surveyed her kingdom. Her office was a monument to success, a glass-walled penthouse that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, as if the entire city were a circuit board she had designed and now controlled. The air was cool, filtered, and carried a faint scent of lemon and bergamot, a stark contrast to the industrial smell of the labs below. The floor was polished Italian marble, and on her desk, a single flawless orchid stood as a testament to controlled, expensive beauty. This was the inner sanctum of Velocity Motors, and Alicia was its undisputed queen. At 42, she possessed a razor-sharp beauty that was as much a weapon as her intellect. Her blonde hair was pulled into a severe, flawless bun, not a single strand daring to stray. Her custom-tailored Alexander Wang suit cost more than Jeremy's monthly rent, and it was engineered, like everything about her, to project an aura of unassailable authority. She was in the middle of a morning briefing, but briefing was too benign a term. Alicia ran meetings like a battlefield commander assessing her troops before a siege. The damping coefficient is still 0.4% outside the acceptable threshold, she stated. Her voice calm, but laced with a voltage that made the senior engineers in the room flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her silence was more terrifying than any shout. Explain to me how, after 3 months, my lead propulsion team is being defeated by basic physics. Mark, the head of engineering, a man with 2 PhDs, stammered. The simulation models, Alicia, they're not accounting for the real-world vibrational. The real world is where we sell cars, Mark, she interrupted, her emerald eyes locking onto him. I don't pay you for perfect simulations. I pay you for a working prototype. Figure it out, or I will find someone who understands that the word prototype implies a functioning object. She dismissed him with a glance, turning her attention to a marketing report. The man visibly shrank. This was her doctrine. Appearance equals competence. Hesitation was incompetence. A request for more time was failure. In her world, you either presented a solution or you were part of the problem. This ruthlessness wasn't born in a boardroom. It was forged in the fire of dismissal. As one of the only women in her engineering classes at Stanford, she had been consistently underestimated. Her ideas often credited to male classmates. Her ambition labeled as aggression. She had learned a brutal lesson early on. In a room full of people waiting for you to fail, you must strike first. You had to humiliate them before they had the chance to humiliate you. It was a defense mechanism that had hardened into a core personality trait. The young woman who had been patronized was gone, replaced by a queen who tolerated no challengers to her throne. The source of her current fury, and the reason for the palpable tension that had seeped into every floor of Velocity Motors, was the upcoming Global Innovation Summit. In just 3 weeks, she was set to unveil the Velocity One prototype to the world's most powerful investors and automotive journalists. This wasn't just another product launch. It was a coronation. The hybrid engine, with its revolutionary AI-assisted power management, promised to deliver 97% fuel efficiency with 0 emissions. It was the culmination of 3 years of secretive, billion-dollar R&D, a machine that would not just enter the market, but redefine it. Success meant immortality in the tech pantheon. Failure meant becoming a cautionary tale. And the Velocity One was determined to make her one. For weeks, the prototype had been a source of escalating humiliation. It would perform flawlessly in controlled tests, only to betray them at the worst possible moments. The engine would fire up with a promising, clean purr, run with impeccable smoothness for exactly 17 minutes and 42 seconds. And then, without fail, a series of warning lights would flash across the dashboard like a Christmas tree of failure. The core temperature would spike, a harsh, mechanical cough would rattle its core, and it would die. The diagnostic screen would display the same, relentlessly cryptic message. Torque feedback loop, harmonic disruption ducted. It was a ghost in the machine, and it was haunting Alicia's empire. The pressure was turning her engineers into nervous wrecks. They walked on eggshells, their conversations hushed, their eyes darting towards the elevator banks whenever she appeared. They knew the problem was deep, possibly fundamental, but no one dared to voice that fear to Alicia. To suggest a design flaw was to confess their own inadequacy, a professional death sentence. So they tinkered. They updated software, replaced sensors, and ran endless diagnostics, praying for a miracle while the clock ticked down. Jeremy witnessed one of these failures from his usual place in the shadows. He had been sent to the high-security Gold Lab to deliver a box of specialized calibration tools. As he entered, he saw the Velocity 1, a sleek, silver sculpture of ambition, sitting in the center of the room. The engineers, including a pale and sweating Mark, were gathered around a bank of monitors. "Initiating stress test sequence," one of them called out. The engine came to life, its hum a whisper of potential. Jeremy paused, pretending to adjust the contents of his toolbox. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Listen." He heard it, not with his ears, but with his entire being. A faint, almost imperceptible high-frequency whine underpinning the engine's smooth tone. It was a sound he'd heard before, back in Hazelwood, on a truck with a poorly aligned drivetrain. It was the sound of metal protesting, of a vibration building towards a catastrophic failure. His eyes scanned the engine bay, and his instincts, sharpened by a lifetime of practical work, zeroed in on the source. It was the C12 mounting bracket for the hybrid torque converter. He could see, even from 10 feet away, that its design was flawed. It was too flimsy, allowing for a microscopic but critical flex under high-stress conditions. That flex was causing the misalignment, which the sensitive AI was interpreting as a harmonic disruption and triggering a safety shutdown. The engineers were looking for a software bug. The problem was a 50-cent piece of badly designed metal. He saw the solution with utter clarity: a reinforced, billet aluminum bracket. It would take a machinist an hour to make. He opened his mouth, a single, simple observation on his lips. But then he saw the way the engineers looked at him, a flicker of annoyance at his presence, an unspoken, "What are you still doing here?" He saw Alicia, standing apart from the group, her arms crossed, her face an impassive mask, but her eyes burning with a cold fire. He remembered his place, the garage boy, the coffee runner. He closed his mouth. At that exact moment, the digital clock on the wall hit the 17-minute, 42-second mark. A loud bang echoed in the lab, followed by the sickening sound of screeching metal. The engine shuddered violently and fell silent. The air filled with the smell of burnt electronics and despair. The monitors flashed red. "Critical failure. System offline." A dead silence fell over the lab, thick and suffocating. All eyes turned to Alicia. She didn't look at the engineers. She didn't look at the failed prototype. Her gaze swept over the room, cold and dismissive, finally landing on Jeremy, still holding his toolbox by the door. For a split second, her eyes narrowed, as if seeing the irrelevance of his presence as the final insult. Then she spoke, her voice quiet, yet it carried the weight of a guillotine blade. If this thing fails at the demo, she said, her words dropping like stones into the silent room, heads will roll. She turned and walked out, the click of her heels the only sound in the tomb she left behind. Jeremy stood frozen, the truth a heavy, useless weight in his chest, knowing he was perhaps the only one who could stop the coming bloodshed, and knowing he never would. The air in the Velocity Motors demonstration hall was so thick with anticipation you could almost see it, a shimmering haze of ambition and ozone. The day of the Global Innovation Summit had arrived. The massive space, usually a sterile lab, had been transformed into a theater of corporate warfare. Holographic displays flickered with sleek animations of the Velocity One, its specs scrolling in elegant, confident text. The floor was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the anxious faces of the assembled elite. Investors in tailored suits, their wrists heavy with watches that cost more than supercars, mingled with journalists who held their recorders like drawn swords. A low, expectant hum filled the room, the sound of money waiting to be made or lost. This was Alicia Moore's moment, the culmination of 3 years of her life, and she moved through the crowd like a queen on Coronation Day. She was radiant, her smile a perfectly calibrated instrument of charm and authority. But Jeremy, watching from the periphery, saw the tightness around her eyes, the almost imperceptible tremor in her hand as she accepted a glass of champagne. She was a statue with a hairline fracture, holding itself together through sheer force of will. Her elite engineers, Mark and his team, were a hive of frantic last-minute activity. Dressed in pristine white lab coats with the Velocity logo embroidered in gold, they circled the prototype like nervous priests around a sacred temperamental relic. They ran diagnostics, checked connections, their voices hushed and tense. They were performing a ritual, hoping their faith in their own code would be enough. Jeremy's role in this grand spectacle was, as always, one of servitude. His orders were simple: remain invisible and keep the coffee flowing. He navigated the edges of the crowd, a ghost in his simple, clean coveralls, balancing a tray of porcelain espresso cups. He was part of the scenery, a functional prop. As he passed the Velocity One, his trained eyes, honed in a world far from this one, caught something. A slight, almost playful flicker in the indicator light of the primary power converter. It was a transient blink, there and gone. So fast the engineers monitoring the banks of screens missed it entirely. But Jeremy saw it. It was the same flicker he'd seen on an old Camry that had a faulty ground wire, a tiny warning sign before a total electrical failure. His blood ran cold. He stopped, his body tensing. He looked at Mark, who was nervously adjusting his tie. He looked at Alicia, who was laughing a little too brightly at an investor's joke. The words were there, lodged in his throat. It's the power converter. The grounding is unstable. But the memory of 1,000 dismissals, of being called garage boy, of their condescending smiles, sealed his lips. Who was he to speak? He was the coffee runner. He lowered his eyes and moved on, the warning dying unspoken. The moment of truth arrived. Alicia took the stage, her voice amplified and confident, filling the hall. She spoke of revolution, of a new dawn, of bending the very laws of physics to humanity's will. The crowd was captivated. With a theatrical flourish, she gestured to the Velocity One. Ladies and gentlemen, the future. Mark, His hand, trembling slightly, pressed the ignition. The engine roared to life. A clean, powerful, beautiful sound. It was a symphony of engineering. Relief washed over the engineers' faces. Alicia's smile became genuine, triumphant. For a full minute, it was perfect. The investors nodded, impressed. Camera flashes popped like stars. Then, the flicker Jeremy had seen returned. This time, it wasn't playful. It was a frantic, dying strobe. The engine's smooth purr hitched, sputtered like a man choking, and then coughed into a violent, shuddering silence. The sudden quiet was more deafening than the engine had been. For a second, nobody moved. The holographic displays, oblivious, continued to play their triumphant animations over the scene of catastrophic failure. Then, panic erupted. The engineers surged forward, their professionalism evaporating, their voices rising in a cacophony of confusion. "Reboot the system. It's the AI core. No, it's the fuel cell." They were blind men arguing over the color of an elephant. The investors began to whisper, their faces hardening from admiration to skepticism, and then to outright scorn. The journalists leaned forward, their recorders now pointed at the chaos, smelling blood in the water. The cameras, once aimed at a marvel of innovation, were now documenting a billion-dollar public implosion. Alicia stood frozen on the stage. The radiant queen was gone, replaced by a woman watching her kingdom crumble in real time. The color drained from her face, leaving 2 spots of furious red on her cheeks. Her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides. The rage coming off her was a physical heat. "Do something," she hissed at Mark, her voice a venomous whisper that carried across the suddenly quieting room. We don't know what's wrong," he stammered, his face ashen. A nervous, high-pitched laugh cut through the tension. One of the junior engineers, desperate to break the awful silence, gestured toward Jeremy, who was standing frozen with his empty tray. "Maybe the janitor can fix it." The comment hung in the air, absurd and cruel. All eyes turned to Jeremy. Alicia's gaze followed, her emerald eyes, once full of contemptuous dismissal, now blazing with a wild, cornered fury. She saw an outlet, a scapegoat, a way to deflect the humiliation onto someone even lower than her failing engineers. She stepped off the stage and walked toward him. The crowd parted for her, a sea of suits yielding to her storm. She stopped so close he could see the fine tremble of her lower lip, smell the cold, expensive perfume that now seemed to smell of desperation. Her voice, when it came, was low and dangerously calm, laced with a sarcasm so sharp it could draw blood. "You," she said, the single word dripping with a lifetime of prejudice. "You think you can fix this?" She didn't wait for an answer. She was putting on a show, a final dramatic act of defiance. "Fine, do it." She raised her voice, projecting to the entire room, her lips twisting into a mockery of a smile. "If you can make this engine run before they leave, I'll give you anything you want." She paused, letting the suspense build, her eyes sweeping over the stunned audience, before landing back on him. "Hell, I'll even marry you right here in front of everyone." The room erupted, not in panic this time, but in incredulous, nervous laughter. It was the cruelest sound Jeremy had ever heard. Cameras flashed, capturing his humiliation from every angle. He was a spectacle, the punchline to a joke he never agreed to be in. He stood there, the tray still in his hands, the laughter washing over him. He saw the engineers smirking, the investors looking on with pitying amusement, and Alicia, whose eyes dared him to refuse, to confirm his own worthlessness. In that moment, he thought of his father, not of the lessons in the garage, but of his quiet dignity in the face of hardship. He thought of the medical bills, the sold garage, the dream deferred. He looked at Alicia Moore, at all of them, and something inside him, something that had been bent for so long, finally snapped straight. The laughter died down as he slowly, deliberately, placed the metal tray on a nearby table. The clang it made was surprisingly loud in the hushed room. He didn't look at Alicia. He looked at the dead engine. Then he nodded, just once. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet but clear, not a shred of doubt in it. He walked toward the Velocity 1, rolling up the sleeves of his coveralls as he went. The fabric, stained with the honest grime of real work, was a stark declaration of war against the pristine, useless lab coats. A silence fell, deeper and more profound than before. It was the silence of an audience holding its breath, waiting for the impossible. The silence in the demonstration hall was a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. It was broken only by the sound of Jeremy's work boots on the polished concrete as he walked toward the dead prototype. The laughter had evaporated, replaced by a collective, stunned incredulity. 37 pairs of eyes, investors, engineers, journalists, tracked his every move, a gallery of judgment and morbid curiosity. Jeremy blocked them all out. The smirks, the whispers, the camera lenses staring like unblinking eyes. They faded into a distant hum. In his mind, the sterile, chrome and glass hall dissolved, replaced by the warm, dusty light of his father's garage. The scent of Georgia pine and motor oil filled his senses. A gospel hymn played softly from an old radio caked with grime. "Remember, Jay," his father's voice rumbled, a gentle anchor in the storm of his nerves. "Your eyes will trick you. Your pride will deafen you. But if you quiet everything else, the machine will always tell you the truth. You just have to be humble enough to listen." He reached the Velocity 1. Up close, it was even more imposing, a beautiful, complex corpse. He ignored the bank of monitors flashing with red error codes. He ignored the chief engineer, Mark, who hovered nearby, his arms crossed, his face a mask of pure contempt. Jeremy closed his eyes. He placed his bare hand on the engine block. The metal was still warm. The engineers gasped. It was an unthinkable act, primitive, almost sacrilegious in this temple of high technology. "What is he doing?" a voice muttered from the crowd. "He's praying," someone else snickered. Alicia's voice, sharp with impatience and humiliation, cut through. "He's wasting everyone's time. This is a circus." But Jeremy was listening. Through his fingertips, through some deep, inherited intuition. He felt it. A faint, irregular pulse. A tremor. A story of distress the computers were too stupid to understand. "It's not the noise, son," Arthur Wilson's ghost whispered in his memory. "It's the silence between the noise. That's where the secret lives." In the quiet space between the engine's failed cycles, Jeremy heard it. A high-frequency vibration, a harmonic shiver that shouldn't be there. It was the same song a failing transmission had sung in a 1998 Ford F-150 he and his father had resurrected one sweltering July. His eyes snapped open. They were clear, focused, devoid of doubt. He looked not at the executives, but at the intricate web of wires and sensors snaking around the engine's core. "The problem isn't in the combustion mapping or the AI core," he said, his voice calm and steady, carrying in the dead quiet. "It's in the hybrid converter. You've got a misaligned torque feedback sensor. It's feeding corrupted data into the primary relay, telling the computer the engine is under catastrophic stress. The eye isn't failing. It's doing exactly what it's programmed to do. It's shutting down to prevent a disaster that isn't actually happening." For a full 3 seconds, there was no sound. Then Mark, the chief engineer, burst out with a harsh, derisive laugh. Sensor? You're guessing. We replaced that unit twice. The diagnostics are clean. You have no idea what you're talking about, you janitor." The word hung in the air, its ugliness a final challenge. Jeremy didn't argue. He didn't even look at Mark. He reached into the chest pocket of his coveralls and pulled out his father's old screwdriver. The metal handle was worn smooth from a lifetime of use, its shaft stained with the history of 1,000 fixes. It was a relic, an object of ridicule in this room of million-dollar equipment. A fresh wave of whispers and chuckles rippled through the investors. One of them, a man with a silver beard and a bored expression, checked his watch and sighed audibly. He tapped his companion on the shoulder and gestured toward the exit. The spell was breaking. The reality of the failure was reasserting itself. The crowd began to shift, a slow tide turning toward the doors. Alicia saw it. Her moment was slipping away completely, buried under the absurdity of a janitor with a screwdriver. She uncrossed her arms, her body rigid with fury and defeat. This was the final, pathetic act. Jeremy saw none of it. His world had shrunk to a single point. He found the sensor housing, a small, unremarkable plastic unit near the base of the engine. With the delicacy of a surgeon, he used the tip of the screwdriver to loosen 2 tiny clips. He didn't consult a schematic. He didn't need to. He could see the flaw in his mind. "Sometimes the factory gets it wrong," his father said, guiding his small hands. "You gotta trust your own eyes more than their blueprints." Inside, a hair-thin wire was slightly out of place, its connection compromised by a vibration frequency the original designers had never accounted for. It wasn't broken, just lazy. He gently nudged it back into its proper alignment with the screwdriver, ensuring a perfect connection. He then tightened a grounding bolt that had been left a quarter turn too loose, a tiny oversight with massive consequences. The entire procedure took less than 60 seconds. He closed the housing, slipped the sacred screwdriver back into his pocket, and wiped his hands on a rag. He looked over at Mark, whose smirk had faltered, replaced by a dawning, sickening confusion. Without a word, Jeremy reached for the main power switch. "Don't!" Mark shouted, but it was too late. Jeremy flipped the switch. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The crowd froze. Alicia closed her eyes. It was the most profound silence Jeremy had ever heard. A vacuum of hope. Then, a light on the dashboard flickered from red to amber. A deep, healthy, guttural roar erupted from the Velocity 1. It wasn't the sputter of before. It was the sound of raw, unleashed power, smooth and confident and alive. The engine settled into a perfect, resonant idle, humming with a vitality that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of everyone present. The massive screen behind the car, which had been flashing Core AI offline, critical failure, now glowed a brilliant, triumphant green. System stable, all systems optimal. The shock in the room was absolute, a physical force that stole the air. Jaws hung open. The investor with the silver beard stopped mid-stride, his hand still on the door handle, his eyes wide. Cameras flashed, but this time, they were capturing a miracle. Then, one investor began to clap, then another, and another. The applause swelled, hesitant at first, then thunderous, a roaring wave of relief and astonishment that shook the glass walls of the demonstration hall. Alicia Moore stood utterly still, her face a canvas of obliterated assumptions. The rage, the contempt, the arrogance, all of it was wiped away, replaced by a stunned, profound disbelief. She stared at Jeremy as if seeing him for the very first time. She took a step toward him, her voice a ghost of its former self. "How?" she stammered. "How did you do that?" Jeremy looked from her to the applauding investors, to the ashen-faced engineers. He picked up a clean rag from his cart and slowly wiped the single smudge of grease from his fingers. He met her gaze, his own eyes calm and deep, holding the wisdom of the garage, of his father, of 1,000 silenced truths. "I didn't fix it," he said, his voice quiet, yet carrying to every corner of the wrapped room. "I listened to it." The applause in the demonstration hall did not end. It simply migrated, transforming into a digital tsunami that crashed over the world. Someone's smartphone recording, shaky and raw, was uploaded before the last investor had even left the building. It was a perfect, self-contained drama. The arrogant CEO, the humiliated mechanic, the impossible challenge, the stunning victory. Within hours, the clip was everywhere. It was no longer just a video. It was a cultural flashpoint. The algorithm, with its cold, unerring instinct for conflict and catharsis, gave it 1,000 titles, but the one that stuck was simple and powerful. The black mechanic who fixed the impossible. It exploded. Tech blogs, mainstream news outlets, and social media influencers seized upon it. Headlines wrote themselves, dripping with irony. Velocity Motors' $8 million secret was in the janitor's closet. CEO's public mockery backfires as overlooked employee saves company. The maintenance boy who knew more than the MIT grads. Jeremy Wilson, the man who had been a ghost in the halls of Velocity Motors, was now a ghost no more. His face, calm, dignified, and profoundly competent in the video, became an overnight symbol. He was a Rorschach test for societal frustrations. For some, he was a symbol of talent overlooked by corporate myopia. For others, he was a stark representation of the racial and class biases embedded in the tech industry's glossy facade. The phrase, "I didn't fix it, I listened to it," was turned into memes, printed on t-shirts, and held up as a mantra for a different kind of intelligence, one born of humility and hands-on wisdom. For Alicia Moore, the viral storm was not a vindication but a relentless, public shaming. The narrative was brutal. She was no longer the visionary queen of Velocity. She was the CEO who mocked her own genius. Comment sections filled with vitriol. Business analysts questioned her judgment and leadership on live television. The stock price, after an initial jump from the positive news of the fixed prototype, began to wobble under the weight of the scandal. The board, a collection of old money and sharp-eyed investors who had always been wary of her ruthless style, finally had the leverage they needed. The call came that evening, their voices cold and clipped through her office speakerphone. The message was unambiguous. "Fix this, Alicia. The publicity is a disaster. The world sees us as arrogant and blind. Make a statement. Make it right. Or we will find someone who can." The pressure was a vice, tightening around her career, her reputation, everything she had built. Which is why, the next morning, Jeremy found himself summoned to the 42nd floor for the first time. He stood in the center of her immense office, feeling the vast space and the intimidating view. He was still in his coveralls, a deliberate choice. He would not pretend to be one of them. Not yet. Alicia was behind her desk, a fortress of polished marble and ambition. She looked tired, the flawless facade chipped away by a sleepless night and the sting of global humiliation. "Jeremy," she began, her voice all business, bypassing any greeting. "That was quite a demonstration yesterday." He said nothing, simply waited. "The board and I have been discussing your position here," she continued, folding her hands on the desk. "It's clear your talents are being wasted. We'd like to offer you a new role, senior technical analyst, a significant salary increase, stock options, a team. You'll report directly to Mark." It was a generous offer on paper, but Jeremy heard what it was: a transaction, a PR stunt to quell the outrage. It was a promotion designed to silence critics, not to honor his skill. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of her cruelty, no recognition of the dignity she had stripped from him. It was a corporate bandage, slapped on a deep, festering wound. He looked at her, his gaze steady, and the silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. "Respect can't be a promotion, Ms. Moore," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's a choice. It's the choice you make when you look at a person and decide their worth before they've proven it. You and everyone in this building made that choice about me a long time ago. A new title doesn't change that." The air crackled. Alicia's composure flickered. She was used to people accepting her offers with gratitude. She was not used to having her power, and the very nature of her offer, so calmly and clearly dismantled. "What are you saying?" she asked, a sliver of the old ice returning to her voice. "I'm saying the problem at Velocity Motors isn't a broken engine. It's a broken culture. You have some of the brightest minds in the world, and they're so afraid of being wrong, of looking foolish, that they can't see a solution that's right in front of them. They'd rather follow a broken manual than trust their own instincts. You taught them that." He wasn't yelling. He wasn't even accusing. He was stating a fact, and that made it all the more devastating. Alicia stood up and walked to her glass wall, turning her back to him. She looked out over the city she had once felt she commanded. The tension in the room was no longer just about humiliation and anger. It was now threaded with a reluctant, unsettling admiration. This man, whom she had reduced to a punchline, possessed a clarity and integrity that her entire expensive organization lacked. He had seen through her offer in an instant. He had outmaneuvered her not with technical skill, but with truth. "What would you have me do then?" she asked, her voice softer now, her reflection a ghost in the glass. "I'll take the job," Jeremy said, surprising her. She turned to face him. "But not as a senior analyst. And I won't report to Mark. I'll take it on my terms. I want to lead a new team, my way. I want to rebuild the department from the ground up, the way engines should be built, with respect." He wasn't asking for permission. He was stating his terms. Alicia stared at him, the man in the grease-stained coveralls standing in the heart of her empire, making demands. The irony was a bitter pill. The board wanted her to control the narrative, to contain him. But as she looked at him, calm, resolute, and holding all the leverage, she realized the terrifying, exhilarating truth. Her empire, her future, the very survival of Velocity Motors, might now depend entirely on the man she had humiliated. And he knew it. The contract was signed, but the real work began in the silence that followed. Jeremy had not been given a corner office on the executive floor. Instead, he had requested Lab 7B, a smaller, slightly outdated space in the building's eastern wing, far from the gleaming gold lab where the Velocity One had failed. It was his first symbolic act, a return to the roots of work, away from the theater of power. His title was unconventional, negotiated in that tense meeting with Alicia, Lead Innovation Specialist. It came with a small, cross-functional team of his choosing. He didn't pick the star graduates with the most impressive pedigrees. He chose Anya, a brilliant but perpetually overlooked materials scientist from the testing department. Ben, a junior engineer with a passion for acoustic diagnostics that his superiors dismissed as unscientific. And Maria, a former assembly line technician whose practical knowledge of how parts actually fit together was considered inferior to theoretical design. His second act, on his first official day, was more revolutionary. He held his first team meeting not in a conference room, but in the main break room during the morning rush. He stood on a chair, not to command attention, but to be seen. "Hi," he said, his voice cutting through the clatter of coffee mugs. "I'm Jeremy. Most of you know me as the guy who used to bring you this coffee." He held up a pot, eliciting a few nervous chuckles. "I'm not here to tell you how to do your jobs. I'm here because I believe the person who assembles the part, the person who cleans the lab, and the person who writes the code all hold a piece of the puzzle. In my lab, there are no stupid questions. There is only the truth of the machine. If you see something, say something. Your voice matters here." The message rippled through Velocity Motors with the speed of a seismic shock. For the janitorial staff, it was a validation they had never dreamed of. For the junior engineers and technicians, it was a permission slip to think freely. Slowly, tentatively, the culture began to shift. The invisible barriers between the thinkers and the doers began to erode. In Lab 7B, the air hummed not with tension, but with a focused, collaborative energy. Productivity didn't just rise. It soared, fueled by a newfound sense of collective ownership. Jeremy's leadership was not one of commands, but of questions. "What does it feel like?" he'd ask, placing a hand on a prototype. "What does it sound like right before it fails?" He began codifying his father's philosophy into a new methodology. They became known as the Wilson protocols, a set of testing procedures that prioritized sensory and acoustic feedback alongside digital data. Engineers were encouraged to close their eyes and listen, to feel for vibrations, to use intuition as a diagnostic tool. To the old guard, it was heresy. But when Lab 7B began consistently identifying and solving problems that had baffled other departments for weeks, the heresy started to look like genius. Industry journals picked up on the Wilson protocols, and global recognition began to trickle in, not for a flashy product, but for a profound shift in process. Alicia observed this transformation from a distance, a complex storm of emotions warring within her. Her initial motivation had been purely pragmatic: contain the scandal, leverage Jeremy's talent, and stabilize the stock price. But what she saw challenged the very foundations of her leadership. She watched Jeremy in Lab 7B through the glass walls, noting how he listened as intently to Maria, the technician, as he did to Anya, the scientist. She saw the lack of fear in his team's eyes, the free exchange of ideas. There was no posturing, no jockeying for position. There was only the work. The arrogance that had been her armor began to feel heavy, unnecessary. A reluctant, unsettling admiration for Jeremy started to take root. It wasn't just about his technical skill. It was about his integrity, his quiet, unshakable confidence that required no humiliation of others to sustain itself. The first major success from Lab 7B was a compact, hyper-efficient battery cooling system. It was elegant, simple, and solved an overheating issue that had plagued the R&D department for months. At the small unveiling, Jeremy stood before the team and the handful of executives who attended. "This system works," he said simply, "because of all of you. But I want to dedicate this first success." He paused, his voice thickening slightly. "I want to dedicate it to my father, Arthur Wilson. He was the one who taught me that the most advanced diagnostic tool in the world is the willingness to listen." It was a moment of profound vulnerability in a company that worshipped invincibility. Alicia, standing at the back of the room, felt a strange tightness in her chest. It wasn't pity. It was a glimpse of a power she had never understood, the power of authentic connection. Later that evening, after the lab had emptied, Alicia walked through the quiet halls, her mind racing. She found herself drawn to Lab 7B. She pushed the door open and stood in the silence. The space was clean, but lived in, a testament to hard work and mutual respect. On her way out, something on her desk caught her eye. It wasn't there before. Lying perfectly centered on the polished marble was an old, worn screwdriver. The metal handle was smooth from use, the shaft stained with the history of 1,000 fixes. It was the same one he had used to perform his miracle. Taped to the handle was a small, folded piece of paper. Her heart hammering in a way it hadn't in years, she picked it up and unfolded it. The message was written in a clean, steady hand. For those who finally learned to listen. She stared at the tool, then out of the window at the darkening city. The gesture was not an insult, nor a challenge. It was an invitation, a passing of the torch. It was the most valuable thing he owned, and he had left it for her. She picked it up. The weight of it in her hand felt unfamiliar, solid, and real. For the first time, Alicia Moore, the billionaire CEO, understood that she had been building her empire with the wrong tools. The Jacob K. Javits Convention Center was a cathedral of chrome and ambition, humming with the energy of the International Motor Expo. A year earlier, Velocity Motors had faced its very public humiliation. Today, they were the undisputed headliners. The air crackled with anticipation, a stark contrast to the funeral silence of their last demonstration. This time, the stage was not set for a solitary CEO to command, but for a story to be told. The press pit was a dense thicket of cameras, and the front rows were filled with investors who had once walked out, now back with checkbooks ready. The lights dimmed. A single spotlight illuminated the stage, and walking into it was not Alicia Moore, the fearsome queen, but a changed leader. Her demeanor was calm, her smile genuine, lacking its former sharp edge. In her hand, she held not a tablet with presentation slides, but a simple note card. "A little over a year ago," she began, her voice clear and carrying easily through the hall, "this company failed publicly. An engine that was meant to represent our future instead revealed a deep-seated flaw in our present. Not a flaw in metal or code, but a flaw in perspective. We were so busy talking, we forgot how to listen." The crowd was utterly silent, captivated. "Today," she continued, "we are not just unveiling a new propulsion system. We are unveiling a new philosophy. It is a philosophy born not in a boardroom, but in a small-town garage. It was brought to us by a man we initially dismissed, who then patiently taught us the most valuable lesson we could ever learn." She turned, her gesture open and full of genuine respect. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce the architect of our future, the man who taught us to listen, Jeremy Wilson." The applause was thunderous as Jeremy walked onto the stage. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a simple, dark button-down shirt, a subtle but powerful statement. He looked out at the sea of faces, took a deep breath, and pressed a button on a small remote. A velvet cloth dropped away, revealing the heart of the new system. It was beautiful in its elegant simplicity. A compact, interwoven network of components, all centered around a core that pulsed with a soft, blue light. "This," Jeremy said, his voice steady and warm, "is the Arthur W. Drive System." A wave of understanding moved through the crowd. The name was not a corporate acronym. It was a person, a tribute. "My father, Arthur Wilson, was a mechanic," Jeremy explained, a faint smile touching his lips. "He never had a degree from a prestigious university, but he had a PhD in patience. He could hear a story in a misfire, diagnose a dream from a rattle. He taught me that humility is the first tool you must pick up before you can fix anything truly complex." He spoke not of torque and efficiency metrics, but of purpose. He believed an engine shouldn't just be powerful. It should be accessible. It should serve people, not bankrupt them. This system is the embodiment of that belief. It's efficient, durable, and designed to be understood, not just operated. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, ensuring every word landed. "He taught me that the most impossible thing to fix isn't a broken machine. It's a closed mind. This drive system is proof that when we choose to listen, to the machines, to the people who work with them, to the quiet voices we usually ignore, we can redefine what's possible." With that, he initiated the live demonstration. The Arthur W. Drive System hummed to life, its sound a clean, sustainable whisper of power. It ran flawlessly, not for 17 minutes, but for the entire duration of his speech and beyond. The giant screens displayed its performance data, efficiency ratings that shattered previous records, emission levels that were virtually undetectable. The hall erupted. Investors rose to their feet, cheering. The press surged toward the stage, cameras flashing. It was more than a successful product launch. It was a coronation of a new ideal. Alicia stood off to the side of the stage, out of the spotlight. She watched Jeremy, calm and dignified at the center of the storm, and she felt no jealousy, no need to control the narrative. Instead, a profound, quiet pride filled her, mixed with a deep, personal emotion she couldn't quite name. Her eyes were bright, not with the cold fire of ambition, but with the warmth of hard-won grace. Later, After the crowds had thinned and the stage lights had dimmed, she found him backstage, looking over the drive system one last time. "Jeremy," she said. He turned. The noise of the expo faded into the background. She didn't offer a handshake or a corporate platitude. She simply looked at him, her guard completely down, and spoke the truth that had been crystallizing inside her for months. "You didn't just fix my engine, Jeremy," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion that was both painful and liberating. "You fixed me." It was the most vulnerable admission of her life, a confession that the flaw had not been in her company, but in her own soul. Jeremy looked at her, seeing not the billionaire CEO, but the woman who had finally learned to listen. He gave a small, understanding nod, his father's wisdom finding its way to his lips once more. "Engines, people," he replied softly. "They're not that different." In that quiet, behind-the-scenes moment, surrounded by the tangible proof of his genius and her redemption, the last of the walls between them crumbled to dust. The impossible had not just been redefined, it had been made whole. The Georgia sun, warm and familiar, felt like a balm on Jeremy's skin. It was a different heat than the sharp, reflective glare of Manhattan's glass towers. This was a slow, forgiving warmth that baked the red clay earth and smelled of pine and possibility. A few months had passed since the expo, and the world had settled into a new, more truthful rhythm. The old Wilson & Son auto garage, once a place of financial struggle and painful memory, now stood restored. The weathered sign had been repainted, the letters crisp and proud. Below the name, new lettering read, "The Arthur W. Wilson Foundation, Innovation and Mentorship Workshop." It was no longer a monument to a dream deferred, but a beacon for dreams yet to be born. A small crowd was gathered out front. Local community leaders, bright-eyed students from nearby colleges, and a handful of journalists. At the center stood Jeremy. And beside him, not as a distant executive, but as a committed partner, stood Alicia Moore. She was dressed not in a power suit, but in smart, understated casual wear. Her posture relaxed, her smile easy and genuine. The change in her was not an act. It was a fundamental recalibration of her soul. They stood together, a living testament to the power of a second chance. "This garage," Jeremy said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet, intimate space, "was my father's universe. It was where he taught me that our worth isn't measured by our title, but by our integrity. That the truest solutions are often the simplest, if we're brave enough to look for them." He announced the full ride scholarship, established in his father's name, for aspiring Black engineers from rural communities. It wasn't just about money, it was about access. It was about ensuring that the next Jeremy Wilson wouldn't have to choose between his dreams and his duty, that his genius wouldn't be left to gather dust in the shadows of a system designed to overlook it. Alicia spoke briefly, her words devoid of corporate jargon. "Arthur Wilson built more than engines," she said, her gaze sweeping over the young, hopeful faces in the crowd. "He built character. He built legacy. Velocity Motors is proud to support a foundation that champions the kind of hands-on genius that truly moves the world forward." The applause was warm, not for a billionaire, but for a believer. After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled and toured the new workshop, Jeremy slipped away. He pushed open the familiar side door and stepped back into the garage. The space was transformed yet hauntingly familiar. The grime was gone. The floor sealed and clean. The walls were lined with new tools and modern workbenches for the students. But the soul of the place remained. The same sunlight streamed through that single dusty window, illuminating dancing motes in the air. And there, in the center of the bay, covered by a simple canvas tarp, was the past. Jeremy walked over and, with a gentle tug, pulled the cover away. Revealed was the old Chevrolet straight-six engine that he and his father had rebuilt together the summer he turned 14. It was a dinosaur, a simple, heavy piece of iron and steel, utterly obsolete in the world of AI and hybrid systems. Its paint was chipped, its manifolds rusted in places. But to Jeremy, it was the most beautiful machine in the world. He ran a hand over the cool, pitted metal, memories flooding back. His father's large, guiding hands over his small, fumbling ones. The smell of his sweat, the sound of his patient voice explaining the function of each piston, each valve. He found the can of oil and poured some into the cylinders, letting it sit. He checked the fluids, his movements a slow, reverent ritual. Then, he reached for the battery cables. He paused, taking in a deep breath of the air, now clean, but still carrying the faint, ghostly scent of oil and dreams. He heard the echo of a gospel hymn from a phantom radio, felt the presence of the man who had given him everything. He connected the cables. He leaned into the engine bay, his father's old screwdriver, the one he'd left on Alicia's desk and she had solemnly returned to him, firm in his hand. He touched the starter solenoid. The engine groaned, a deep, reluctant sound of metal stirring from a long slumber. It coughed, sputtered, and for a heart-stopping moment, Jeremy was a boy again, praying for the machine to come to life. Then, with a final, determined roar, it caught. The engine rumbled to life, settling into a loud, clattering, imperfect, and gloriously alive idol. The whole block shook with its vintage, unrefined power. It was the antithesis of the silent, efficient hum of the Arthur W. drive system. It was raw, honest, and real. Jeremy stood there, listening to its song, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was the sound of his childhood, the sound of his father, the sound of a promise kept. In the doorway, Alicia watched him, her arms crossed, her eyes soft. She didn't interrupt. She simply listened, understanding that this was a sacred moment. Jeremy placed his hand on the rumbling engine block, feeling its familiar, powerful vibration travel up his arm and straight into his heart. It was a heartbeat, strong, steady, unbroken. He looked around the garage, at the new tools waiting for new hands, at the future taking root in the soil of the past. The sound of the old engine seemed to fill not just the room, but the entire world, a timeless hum of legacy and justice. Some engines are built to run fast. Others are built to last. My father built one that never stopped running, right here,